Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. And what we're going to be addressing, among other things, is the dynamic of slavery denial. So we're going to be addressing the question that keeps coming up regarding whether or not there was an actual transatlantic slave trade. It seems like it's pretty self-evident, but apparently it is not self-evident to a number of people. We're going to address in this context HR 40 and the issue of slavery denial. We're going to look at this dynamic of using art to facilitate slavery denial. We're going to also look at the differences between chattel slavery and sharecropping. We're going to look at the definition of what is a slave. We're going to look at the construct of human trafficking. And then we're going to look at some evidence of the slave trade to show definitively that the transatlantic slave trade did occur. We're going to look at some slave voyages and ads. We're going to look at some census data. We're also going to look at this dynamic of slavery versus indentured servitude, and so we're going to cover that. We're also going to be looking at this dynamic of transatlantic convict leasing in this same context. And in this context, we're also going to look at this dynamic of individuals who historically were classified as Negro, who were neither African nor American. And in that context, we're also going to look at this dynamic related to the slave Bible and why the slave Bible was not used as a part of missionary work in the United States. And finally, we're going to wrap up with a request that when individuals seek to change history, that they show proof, provide some sort of concrete, tangible, verifiable, valid, and reliable evidence to undergird that new assertion. And as always, if this appears on anything other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Before we go into the discussion related to slavery denial and the evidence related to the transatlantic slave trade, it's important to start off with a discussion related to slavery denial and some of the socio-political propaganda that is undergirding some of this slavery denial dynamic. And so one of the things that is happening is that there are a number of ancillary conversations that are going on, a number of ancillary dynamics that are undergirding this slavery denial. And one thing is this propaganda related to slavery denial and quote-unquote Indians and economics. There's propaganda related to that, and then there is again some propaganda related to this dynamic of Western pan-class socioeconomic struggle. That's coupled with this ideology or rhetoric related to Eastern Marxist-Leninist socioeconomic ideology. And so there's a dynamic going on there that is related to slavery denial and this socioeconomic political propaganda dynamic that's going on. And so this comes with encouragement for people to perhaps separate those discussions. And so if people are going to be discussing slavery denial, it might be helpful to just stick with the evidence related to slavery denial and not conflate it with this Marxism-Leninism propaganda dynamic. And so what people are doing pretty much is using a bait and switch dynamic. And so they will start off with discussions related to reparations and slavery, and then it segues into conversations related to Indian identity, and then it segues then into conversations related to economics. It segues then into propaganda related to class struggle, and then that leads into some underpinnings related to this Eastern socioeconomic philosophy. And so if people are putting themselves out as educators, it's important that they be clear about what it is that they are doing. And so if what they are doing is really trying to look at slavery in a historical context, it's probably helpful to keep that pretty clean and not make it really murky with a lot of propaganda related to Indian identity and this Eastern Marxist-Leninist ideology that keeps undergirding some of these conversations. And we're going to use H.R. 40 as our starting point for our discussion related to slavery denial. One of the things that H.R. 40 is concerned with is the dynamic of slavery denial. So in addition to addressing the outgrowth of slavery and Jim Crow, one of the things that they are talking about addressing is this issue of denying slavery. And so one of the things they point out in H.R. 40 is they want to address the manner in which textual and digital instructional resources and technologies are being used to deny the inhumanity of slavery and the crime against humanity of people of African descent in the United States. And so this is very important to note because this clearly has been an issue that has been going on for a while, and it is escalating. And one of the unusual dynamics related to this slavery denial is that the escalation is coming from individuals who have historically been understood as African Americans. And many of those individuals have now taken on an Indian identity. And so with that, you see this increase in this denial of the transatlantic slave trade. And so we are going to very expediently address the evidence that demonstrates that the transatlantic slave trade did in fact occur. And we're going to look at some other dynamics that come up in terms of slavery denial. One of the things that is happening is that art is being used to facilitate slavery denial. And the way it's working is that people are mixing half-truths and half-lies related to the art. What's also happening is that almost out of nowhere, all of this art is popping up that is depicting individuals understood as indigenous to America as darker than they had previously been pictured. And so what's happening is that people are receiving a lot of propaganda related to these pieces of artwork. And the propaganda goes pretty much like this. You look at the people on the screen, they are darker than what would normally be understood as the complexion of Native Americans or American Indians. And so what people are doing then is making a leap with, if these individuals look this way, then all African Americans, all Black Americans, all Negro Americans, all colored Americans, they must also be Indian. And so there is a huge leap and an extrapolation. And so what's happening is this artwork is often used to deny that slavery ever occurred. And instead, the propaganda is that every single brown person that is in America started off in America. And they are using this as proof of that versus simply saying there were brown people here, and accordingly, many of the brown people that are still here came from these individuals, or they are related to the people who have this particular type of phenotype. And so, but that's not what's happening. Instead, what is going on is individuals are using this art that, again, most of it has been recently uncovered. It's unclear where a lot of this artwork has apparently been hiding all of these years, but here you have a substantial amount of it that is appearing on the internet and also appearing in all sorts of resources. And so One of the things that people need to be mindful of is simply because there are brown people that were in America, that were indigenous to America, that does not equate to all brown people in America also being Indian. There are brown people all over the world. And so it would be erroneous for someone to go to Australia, for instance, look at themselves in the mirror and say, because I am brown and people here are brown, that means that I am an Aborigine of Australia. And so it's the same dynamic. And now we're going to turn our attention to the evidence related to the transatlantic slave trade. And as you can see here, looking at the 1850 census, there was a recorded number of a little over 3 million people who were identified as enslaved at that time. And we're going to go over some census data so that you can see how they were coming up with these numbers over time. And we're also going to look at some other information to demonstrate to you that slavery did transpire. And one of the things that should be happening when individuals present to you this idea that the transatlantic slave trade never occurred, it is incumbent upon them to provide evidence of this assertion. And it's not enough for someone to simply make the statement, show a picture of something, and then people accept that and go away with that, and then act upon that. And so it's very important when someone is seeking to revise history, they need to provide evidence of that revision. One type of slavery denial involves this dynamic of conflating sharecropping and chattel slavery and insisting that there were no chattel slaves. No people were enslaved in terms of chattel slavery, and instead individuals were simply sharecroppers. Those who understand history fully understand that sharecropping is the dynamic that took place for those individuals understood as free persons after chattel slavery. And so we're going to look at the distinctions between sharecropping and slavery. And so what many individuals are doing is they are saying that there were no enslaved people from Africa. Instead, they have now given the identity of those individuals to quote unquote Indians or Black Indians, Negro Indians. And the insistence now is that there was not slavery, or if there was slavery, it was really minor. So they are asserting that there was no slavery, and that the individuals that are talked about in terms of slavery were actually Indians, and that the Indians weren't actually enslaved, they were simply sharecroppers. The flip of this story is that these quote unquote brown Indians were actually the sharecroppers. So they were the actual farmers, and they had individuals who were of a lighter hue actually working for them. And so they were the abusive individuals who were mistreating people in this sharecropping dynamic. So this script has been totally flipped so that the individuals who historically would have been understood as enslaved and then free persons, those individuals now are being cast as the perpetrators of harm against other groups of people. And so just to be clear, a sharecropper is defined as a tenant farmer, particularly in southern United States. These individuals were historically provided with what was known as credit. There was often a store. They were provided with credit for seed, tools, living quarters, and food. And this was for working the land and also providing a portion of their crops to the actual landlord, so to speak, so the actual farmer. And so oftentimes people became indebted to these farmers, and so it was very difficult for them to get out of this work relationship. And so they were indebted almost in another form form of slavery, but it wasn't exactly slavery. However, there was this indebtedness that was difficult to overcome. Now, we've just covered what a sharecropper is, and we're going to contrast this with slavery. Now, this should seem like common sense that a sharecropper and a slave, an enslaved person, it's not the same dynamic, but because there's been so much conflation, some people are probably confused at this point. And so, in contrast to sharecropping, a person who is enslaved is a person who is considered wholly subject to the will of another person. This person has no personal freedom in terms of their actions. They have no personal ownership of their own. They are under the control and ownership, if you will, of someone known as a master. These individuals, in terms of their possessions, in terms of their body, they are considered as owned by this entity known as a master. It's almost like owning a cup or a saucer or a car or a bottle of water. It's the same dynamic. When you talk about chattel slavery, chattel means property. And so we're not talking about someone who has some sort of freedom, who's working on credit. We're talking about someone who is considered a piece of property, and that individual is considered owned. Now, there's also been conflation related to slavery and employment, and many people are talking about employment is another form of slavery. I offer to you that it is not another form of slavery, and this is the definition of slavery. And so when you're talking about an employee is someone who generally works at what is known as at-will employment, or they are under a contract that they have entered into willingly. And so we're not talking about the same thing when we're talking about slavery and talking about employment. We're not talking about the same thing when we're talking about slavery and sharecropping. And for those who require a dictionary definition, you can see a person who is considered a slave is a person who is held in servitude as the chattel of another person. Again, property. It's one that is completely subservient to a dominating influence. They are held or forced to be in servitude, meaning enslaved. It is the antithesis of being a free person. And so you have a free person being a person who is enjoying civil or political liberty. That individual has the rights of a citizen, and that is not the case when you're talking about someone who is enslaved. Part of denying slavery is this dynamic whereby people are denying the fact that slavery, whether you're talking about hundreds of years ago or you're talking about current times, slavery is a part of this dynamic known as human trafficking. And human trafficking involves organized criminal activity in which human beings are treated as possessions to be controlled and exploited by others. They are forced into labor and other sorts of activities that are illegal. One of the interesting dynamics that is occurring with this slavery denial dynamic is this process whereby individuals who are asserting this, they are asserting that there was really nothing wrong in terms of slavery because it was legal at the time. And so because it was legal at the time, individuals who were enslaved were not entitled to reparation. They were not entitled to restoration. And another unusual dynamic is this comparing and contrasting slavery with the removal of Indians and the taking of land. And there's this dynamic where there is seen this idea of land being more valuable than actual human beings, and this taking of land being more important than the taking of these human lives. And so there's also the dynamic that grows out of that, that basically says that Indians brown Indians who were deprived of their land, they are entitled to restoration, even though this was considered legal when this took place. According to this same paradigm, there's a belief and an assertion that those individuals are entitled to restoration. However, the individuals who were involved in victimized by human trafficking, those individuals were not entitled to restoration because they see that as legal. And so it's an interesting dynamic, and what it really comes down to is a lack of empathy. This slavery denial, that's a big part of what this is. There is a complete and utter lack of empathy for humanity. And but there is this demand that individuals have empathy for this issue related to the land. And so property is being seen as more important than humanity. And we are changing gears now, and we are going to, as promised, look at the evidence of the slave trade. We're going to look at the evidence of the slave trade, both African and European. We've addressed the European slave trade before, but we are going to incorporate it in this discussion because it is completely necessary. It's a completely integrated dynamic that people have not addressed historically. And so we're going to address it. We're going to readdress it. We're going to make sure that when we finish with this discussion, it's going to be very, very clear what took place in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, one of the things you see over here, and this is our first piece of evidence. Again, we are focused on evidence. We're not looking at emotion. We're not looking at stories and fables. We're looking at the evidence. And so what we have here is the aggregate number from 1850. As you can see, in terms of the recording of enslaved persons, you have a substantial number. At that time, you have 3,204,313 individuals who were enslaved in the United States. Now, many people are insisting that the individuals who were identified as African American or who were identified as Negro or slaves, that those individuals were actually Indians. But what you're going to see in the evidence is that there were categories of people, and you'll be able to see that there were distinctions, and there was a specific class known as enslaved individuals. And for those who do not believe that there was a transatlantic slave trade, we're going to first look at this piece of evidence, and it comes from the Slave Voyages database. And this is for the transatlantic portion. And so what you can see here is the number of slaves embarked and the number of slaves disembarked. You can also see the percentages related to adults and children and male versus female here. And so what you can see is, in terms of embarking, you have over the course of centuries here, you have 10 million people embarking and only 9 million disembarking. And so what this represents is a substantial loss of life. So you're talking about well over 1 million people that did not disembark. They did not make it for that total voyage. And so what this also shows is information related to the number of voyages that were made, the average amount of time, and you can also see the standard deviations related to this information. Now, this database is really helpful because you can trace information related to a particular year. You can trace a particular ship. You can trace a particular flag for a particular country. You can trace the actual owner of the vessel. And so there is a substantial amount of information in this database, and this database is going to show, it's going to demonstrate that the slave trade did occur and people were transported across the Atlantic. And so now we're going to look at a more clear breakdown of this data so that you can see the numbers in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. And so what we're looking at now is the year range information. So you can see starting at 1501 all the way down to 1875, you can see the numbers of individuals that were transported to the different locations. And so you can see Europe, mainland North America, Caribbean, Spanish mainland Americas, Brazil, Africa, and other unnamed places. And so what we're going to focus on right now is mainland North America so that you can see very clearly that individuals were in fact transported into mainland North America. It's very important to note that we are looking at the transatlantic information. You can see that that's what I have lit up there. There's also intra-America, and so that would be other data that you would see. So right now we are not looking at intra-America, we're looking at transatlantic. And so what you can see is that in terms of coming to mainland North America, now this is in conflict with information that suggests an earlier time in terms of the start of the transatlantic slave trade in mainland North America. But what you have here is they have recorded enslaved individuals arriving from 1651 to 1675, and you see 1,675 individuals. Then you see it pick up the next time period, and you see 10,000, then 39,000, 96,000, 122,000. Now you see a significant drop at this time. This coincides with the Revolutionary War, and so that may be part of the reason for that. It's not completely clear, but what you do see is that after the Revolutionary War there is a slight pickup. However, one thing that you might want to note is that prior to the Revolutionary War there was already a determination to abolish slavery in this part of the world. And so what you have here is right after the United States became a country, shortly after that slavery was abolished in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. So then you can see the number goes down to 585 and then 1,922. This was after slavery was actually illegal. And what you see is a total number over this course of time of 360,724. This is significantly more than Europe at 9,000. Some people might ask the question, why did Europe have such a low number given that Europe was actually running the slave trade? And that's a very good question that people should entertain and perhaps do some of their own research on that. You can see that the 360,000 is significantly lower than the total for the total Caribbean and lower than Spanish mainland Americas, also lower than Brazil. Brazil has 3.5 there, and you can see also Africa has 167,000. Now for Africa, that involves individuals who were trafficked in, and also once slavery was abolished, individuals who would be rerouted to Liberia and Sierra Leone, and also some individuals who were coming from other locations. And so there's also this substantial number for this other unnamed places category. So that's also very important. But in terms of our conversation, what this shows is that you have a substantial number of individuals being trafficked into mainland America. And by the time slavery ended, these individuals multiplied to about 4 million. And so you have a significant number. And so when people are denying that slavery took place, or they are denying that any descendants of slavery actually exist, you can see that there was a substantial number back in the 1800s, and undoubtedly that number has blossomed. But let's just say you only have 4 million individuals, and you only have 4 million of them now. That is a substantial number of individuals who would have undergone that dynamic. And for those who like other visual aids, let's look at this graph. One of the things that you will note with this graph is that in terms of Europe, Portugal was the primary enslaver. And then you have Great Britain as second and France as third. And so you can see visually what was going on in terms of the number of slaves embarking. And the United States actually is pretty low there in terms of embarking, and that would go along with the lower number for individuals disembarking in the United States. And here you can see the graph for the sterling cash price in Jamaica in terms of the payment for enslaved individuals in these different areas. And so you see the Senegambia, you see Sierra Leone, Windward Coast, Gold Coast, Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra. And so you can see all of that in relation to economic value. Now this map is important. It's an interactive map, so if you decide to use the slave wages database, you can use the interactive map. This map is very important because it gives you a visual of what was going on in terms of what they call the triangular trade. And so you can see a number of routes that were taken in terms of this triangular trade. And so you can see where there was almost a circular trade going back and forth between Brazil and Africa, and then you see another dynamic going on with mainland North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Europe. And so, in other words, there were 3 legs to these trips, and so you would have ships coming out of Europe, going into Africa, and then coming to mainland North America or the Caribbean. And so that was a pattern that you can see there. And so this constant triangular dynamic that was going on. And when individuals disembarked in the Caribbean, they were often later transported to mainland North America. You might want to get out some paper and pencils because we're getting ready to do some cross-referencing. One of the things that you should do when people present you with information, particularly when it's questionable information, is you need to cross-reference. And so when someone shows some sort of evidence, look to see if it is reliable. Can you find any traces of that somewhere else? And so what we're doing here is we are now showing more evidence to support the reality that the transatlantic slave trade occurred. And so what you have is you have a number of facts. And so what we're looking at here is an advertisement for enslaved individuals. So they are advertising a sale of individuals. And so many people may have seen this sign before, but what's important about this sign is that when looking at this sign, what I did was I went to cross-reference it. And so I went to look to see if there is actually a ship by this name. And interestingly, you will find that there is in the slave wages database a ship by this name. Not only do you have a ship by this name, but you can see the place of purchase in the slave wages database, and it coincides exactly with this advertisement. So you can see down at the bottom they are coming from Sierra Leone. What you also see when you look at the top, it's kind of murky, but if you look closely you can see it says Charleston, and it gives a date of July of 1769. You come down to the slave wages database, and what do you see in terms of principal place of landing? Charleston. It's spelled a little different, but it's still Charleston. And then you can see the year of arrival as 1769. Now you can see that this is a busy little ship because you can see that it came out of Liverpool on another date, also related to Sierra Leone, this time going going to Haiti. And you can see that date is 1783. And so what you have here is what presumably is a valid and reliable piece of evidence. And so not only do you have that information, you also have corroborating the name of the captain of the ship. And so you can see Francis Barr or Francis Bear. You also see that it is consistent in terms of the number of enslaved individuals that are being offered for sale. You can also see here that the understanding, the classification of the individuals being sold, those individuals are identified as Negroes. And we're going to turn our attention back to the census data. We're going to go over this really efficiently. If you want to stop it, you can stop it and then go back and look at particular pages so that you can see the information. But we're going to show you that on the census, starting at 1790, there was a category for enslaved individuals, and there was a separate category for all other free persons. And so there was no need to conflate this. You can see that there was a substantial number of enslaved individuals as early as 1790. And so off to the right-hand side, next to total, you see the number of enslaved individuals, and you can see them for the various districts, starting with Vermont and ending with Georgia. And you can see here that Virginia had the highest number, followed by Maryland, and then followed by North Carolina. It might be a little difficult to see, that's a little squishy, but it's you can see it if you look at it in terms of full screen. So this is the information for 1790, and there's the question of what do people think all other free persons meant in terms of the census at that time, and it's clarified with it meant other free blacks or Africans, people who were not enslaved, so African Americans who were not enslaved. It also included those identified as Native Americans, or what someone would understand as an American Indian, and also immigrants from Asia. And so there was a classification for individuals who were understood as Indian or Native American, and they would have, if they were not enslaved, they would have been included in all other free persons. And again, here you can see the breakdown for quote-unquote free white, quote-unquote free other, and quote-unquote slave. And so you can again see this breakdown, and you can see these various categories. And here you can see a breakdown of the slave population for that 1850 census. And again, you can see it has its own table here, and you can see the breakdown. And a good thing about this is it shows you the breakdown starting at 1790, then 1800, 1810, 1820, and so on. And so you can see that for the various states and territories. So you see Alabama there, all the way down on the screen down to Michigan. And so this gives you an idea of the number of enslaved people in each of these areas. And this gives you information that also includes Minnesota, New Mexico, Oregon, and Utah. And so you can see very few numbers all the way over there to Utah. And then you can see the aggregate again for these various years and for the different places. And so again, you can see there is a substantial number in terms of enslaved individuals. And so those individuals, groups who are denying that individuals were actually enslaved, this is information that you can show them to demonstrate that a large number, you have a large number of individuals enslaved across these territories. And here you have a breakdown of the slave population that breaks down black and mulatto in terms of the population. And so again, you can see this breakdown, and this is really helpful because you see here over on the left, you see free individuals, and they break it down for the number of free individuals who are identified as black, the number of free individuals identified as mulatto, and then you see the total, and then you see the same thing for enslaved individuals. You see the number of enslaved individuals classified as black, the number of enslaved individuals classified as mulatto, and then you see the total, and then you see the breakdown of slave and free individuals classified as black and individuals classified as mulatto. And so again, this is very helpful because one of the things you also see here is a substantial number of individuals classified as black and free and mulatto and free. And so this may not coincide with what people would be expecting to see. And so you do see there is a substantial number in terms of free persons, or what would be considered free persons of color at that time. And this is important because many people believe that all individuals who were of color were also enslaved. And so this helps you to see that not every person who was classified as black or mulatto, they weren't all enslaved. And you can see significant numbers here. And this is a very helpful discussion where the census talks about the breakdown of enslaved individuals in terms of quote unquote racial categories. And so they talk about the breakdown for black and mulatto, and they do a lot of comparing and contrasting. And here you can see information related to plans for abolition. Again, those individuals who are claiming that there was no transatlantic slave trade, there was no slavery in the United States or even in the Americas, it's important that they demonstrate, they provide some sort of evidence to support this, because as you can see, there is substantial evidence to support the fact that slavery occurred. And here is additional information related to the slave tables so that you can see more information related to the breakdown, related to black and mulatto and colored, and also this dynamic of slave families, enslaved families and their dwellings. There's also information related to the breakdown in terms of male and female enslaved individuals. And for individuals who are conflating this dynamic of enslaved individuals and Indians in order to support this idea that the transatlantic slave trade did not occur, this is very helpful, because here you can see for a place such as the Northern District of New York, you can see the breakdown of enslaved individuals, the numbers. They break them also down in terms of the ages, and then you can see free persons of color. And not only do you see that, you see another category off to the right, which is all other persons except Indians non-taxed. And so there is a recognition there that there is another category of individuals, and it is Indians non-taxed. And so you do see categories for a number of entities in terms of individuals identified as free persons of color, and those identified as slaves, and those identified as Indians non-taxed. And here you can see information for the Southern District of New York according to the various statuses. And more slave schedules related to the number of slaves and free persons of color, and again, all other persons except Indians not taxed. And here you have information from 1820. You see slave census data here, and this is for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. So you see the slave data up here. at the top, and then toward the bottom you see free persons of color. And it's interesting to note that there is a substantially larger number in terms of free persons of color in that area versus enslaved individuals. And here you can see 1821 data for New Germantown, and you can see a breakdown of free quote-unquote white males and females. Then you see quote-unquote free colored males and quote-unquote free colored females. And then you also see the numbers for enslaved males and enslaved females. Now again, you can see that the number of free persons of color, that number is larger in this area than the number for enslaved individuals. You also again see all other persons except Indians, non-taxed, mentioned at the bottom there. And here you see the information for the Western District of Pennsylvania. Again, you see the breakdown according to race, and then you see a special category for enslaved individuals. And here you see data broken down for the District of Delaware by classes. And so you can also again see this racial breakdown. You also see they specify free blacks versus free persons of color and enslaved individuals. And what you see here is again, significantly more free individuals than enslaved individuals. And even more evidence is coming out of the state of Maryland, the District of Maryland. And you can see again a slave schedule. You see under 14 years of age, they have the largest number of males enslaved and also females enslaved. And so you see 24,000, you see 14 and under 26 at 14,000, and then 10,000, and then 5,000. And those numbers are substantially similar to the ones for females. And so that's that category. So you have a large number in terms of enslaved individuals in Maryland. And then over to the right, you see the free persons of color. And so this could again mean any number of individuals. But what you are seeing here is there is definitely a class of individuals who were known as enslaved individuals. And so that is very clear in terms of the census data. And here we have information coming out of the Western District of Virginia in terms of these statuses. And so what you can see is up top you see quote unquote free white persons, and then you come on down and you start to see information related to male slaves, female slaves, and then again free persons of color, and then that category of all others except Indians not taxed. And you can see here a substantial number of enslaved individuals coming out of the Eastern District of Virginia. And so you can see 89,000 for the males and 85,000 for the females. And in this particular situation, you have a lower number of free persons of color. And so again, you see that you have this category of enslaved individuals listed on this particular slave schedule. And here you see yet another slave schedule here, and you can see up at the top, you see 49,000 for the males under the age of 14, and then you can see looks like about 45,000 for the females. Again, you see the category of free colored persons. The numbers in this particular category are much smaller than the enslaved individuals. Again, you can see here information related to the slave schedule. You have 73,000 enslaved individuals, males, and then you have 71 females, and then you have a substantially lower number in terms of free individuals who would be understood as free persons of color. But again, you see this large number of enslaved individuals, and they also identify foreigners who are not naturalized on this particular schedule. So this again provides significant information and evidence for the fact that slavery did occur, and it occurred in large numbers. And here we have another slave schedule coming out of Alabama, and this is for the counties of Madison and Montgomery. And what you can see here again is a slave schedule. And so you can see the information for enslaved individuals in the middle, and then you see the free persons of color off to the right. And again, you have that category, that smaller category of all other persons except Indians not taxed. Now, in this particular case, it is noteworthy that you have very few free persons of color in Alabama. So that's a very interesting notation. And here you have aggregate data coming out of the District of Kentucky. And again, you see the slave schedule. So you can see in Kentucky, you have 63,000 and 62,000. 126,000 enslaved individuals, and then you have again that smaller number in terms of free persons of color. You have 2,799 is what that looks like. But again, you see these categories, and what this shows is this is evidence that there were enslaved individuals. Individuals were not simply indentured servants. They weren't simply sharecroppers. You have individuals who were in the category known as slave, the legal category known as slave. One dynamic going on related to slavery denial is this, again, co-opting of identity and assuming that every single brown person in America is actually a full-blooded Indian. And so that is the assertion that is being made. And so individuals who are identifying as Indian, or they are finding ancestors who were Indian, they are often making this leap to this assumption that this translates into them being full-blooded Indians. And so what you can see here is when you look at these roles, and if you have been looking at roles, you've seen this, you can see that when individuals actually find these family members on these roles, one of the things that they should be seeing and noticing is that the quote-unquote blood quantum, it is listed. And so what you can see for, and this is 100 newborn Choctaws by blood, and this is the final roll of citizens and freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes in Indian Territory. And you can see here with these 5 civilized tribes even, who would be getting resources, you can see that there is not this huge number in terms of full blood status. So you see 1/2, 1/64, you see 1/4, 1/16, 1/8. And so this is important to note because the question now becomes, what is that other percentage? And so what is that other ancestry that people are not talking about? What is that other ancestry that people are not claiming? And so clearly you can see that the number of full blood, it's very small. And so again, the question becomes, where is the other portion? And this is important again because, as we've talked about before, you have all of these individuals who are identified as Indian or identifying as Indian, and they have really European names. All of these names, for the most part, are European names, not only the surname, but also the first name and the middle name. And these names span a number of places even. And so you don't just have individuals with British names or English names. You have individuals with Irish surnames and Scottish surnames and Swedish surnames. And so you have a variety. And so the question becomes, where did all of these Indians get all of these European surnames? Now, one of the things that's happening is that individuals are saying that these individuals were not enslaved, and they are using this to prove that the transatlantic slave trade did not occur. So they are saying transatlantic slave trade did not occur, but they are not giving an explanation for why these non-enslaved individuals, non-enslaved Indians, would have this variety of European names. Now, when a person is enslaved, the explanation is that the assumption and explanation is that they took on the slave owner's name. Well, when you're talking about someone who is identifying as being freeborn, that explanation is no longer available. And so you do have to start asking the question of yourself or these individuals, where did these names come from? And so you have everything from Ruby Holloway to Lottie Hazel, Ada Dickerson. You have over here John Simmons, Nora Huddleston, Minnie Turnbull. So you have quite a few names here that are not consistent with having full-blood Indian names. And so again, the question has to be, where did these people get all of these Indian names from? And also, what is the other percentage in terms of that heredity? And so people are not talking about that when they are engaging in this slavery denial dynamic, but it's important to put forth what that other percentage is so that this can be made understandable. And this is 30, and this is also on the same roll, so we're looking at here. And this is Choctaw by blood. Now this one is for those who are not newborn. These are for children and adults. And you can see several individuals who are identified as full-blooded Indians. And you can also see with these individuals, they have significantly European names. As a matter of fact, you can see quite a variety here, and you have everything from Wesley to Moore to Hickman to McAllister to Underwood to Locke to Archer. You have Empson, you have Miller, Swink, Rogers, Davenport, Ashford. These are not Native American or Indian names. Now, one exception is that you do see over on the right-hand side, you do see two individuals specifically with what would be considered Indian or Native American names, and they have European first names. And so those individuals are included there on this list. But for the most part, you have a number of individuals with European surnames, and there should be some explanation for this wide variety of surnames. And they are not just simple, what you would consider Christian missionary provided surnames. This is quite a variety in terms of grouping, in terms of countries, in terms of European ancestry. And again, you can see that the breakdown in terms of that quote-unquote blood quantum. You can see a number of individuals. You have 1/4, you have 3/4, 1/8. And so again, 30 seconds. So again, the question becomes, what is the other percentage? And so if you have, this is the percentage of Indian Choctaw by blood, what's the other percentage? Now, some people are, of course, are going to offer it's another Indian group. Okay, that's all fine and well and good. However, there is no evidence here to support that that other percentage is definitely another Indian group. And so when you put together this missing percentage plus this European name, there is the suggestion that these individuals have European heritage. Another problem related to slavery denial is this dynamic whereby individuals who are claiming Indian identity, they are now claiming that chattel slavery did not occur. And the assertion is that individuals who were presumed enslaved previously, they were not from Africa, and they were actually Indians, and they weren't enslaved, they were only indentured servants. And so we already have the definition of what slavery is. We're going to look at the definition of indentured servitude so that you can see that those two things are not the same. Now let's quickly look at the definition of indentured servant, and this goes along with indentured servitude. Indentured servants are simply individuals who sign contracts basically, and they are bound by indentures to work for another person for a very specific amount of time. So it's a contractual relationship, and they do this in return for travel expenses and maintenance while they are working. And so you usually have indentures for 3-year periods or 7-year periods. There are some instances historically when you might have seen where a child was bound out in terms of mulatto bastardy, and so they were basically criminalizing a child being born. But other than that, when you have an indentured servitude dynamic, it is a contractual dynamic. And so you had this going on when individuals were traveling from Europe and coming to America. So those would be indentured servants. Now, a number of these individuals who are identifying as brown Indians, they are claiming that individuals were not enslaved. They were not coming from Africa and being enslaved. They were instead Indians who just entered into some bad indentured servitude contracts. And so this is a very interesting assertion. It's interesting because these individuals do not provide any evidence to support this assertion. It's not enough to just show a sample of an indenture, show a sample of a contract of some random individual. If the assertion is being made that the millions of individuals in the Americas, in the United States, these individuals who are now identifying as brown Indians, if they are saying that their ancestors and all of the ancestors of all people who are brown in America, these individuals were under these indenture contracts, individuals should be providing evidence of that, not random pictures of random indenture contracts, but there should be evidence that each and every one of these individuals, that 4 million, they were actually bound by indentured servitude contracts, and so they should be able to find those for their ancestors. They should be able to find many of them for all of these individuals that they are claiming were simply indentured servants. Part of the problem is that they won't be able to provide that because that is not the reality. One thing is correct, and that is that a number of individuals were actually indentured servants, and the individuals who were indentured servants were often individuals who were convicts, and they were transported from Europe, as we've discussed before, into the Americas to serve their prison time as indentured servants. And so what happened was they were transported, they were convicted and then transported to America, and then that contract was sold to someone and they worked for that individual for a specific period of time, and then they were released, and they were usually released with some resources to get started with their lives after that. Now, this came about because they had been convicted usually of treason. And so they were given a choice when they were in Europe to either be executed sometimes or to be deported. And so many of them, after they finished their time in the United States, in America, once they finished their time, many of them just chose to stay. One of the problems in terms of tracing ancestry is many people who are brown have determined that their ancestors either came from Africa or they are indigenous to the Americas. And so they are unwilling to entertain the fact that many ancestors came from Europe. They were indentured servants because they came from Europe. And so that indentured servitude story is actually correct. However, it's not correct for the reasons that people are giving. And so people really need to look a little deeper in terms of that ancestry. Some people will say they hit a roadblock when they get to, the 1700s and they can't go any further. And part of that not being able to go any further back is because many people are unwilling to look at the totality of possibilities in terms of how their ancestors ended up here, particularly if individuals are insistent that they are indigenous to the land. They will overlook all sorts of evidence that supports the contention that their ancestors who carried those European names actually came based upon being convicted and came based upon being indentured servants. Now, some individuals didn't come based upon that. Some individuals who had brown ancestors, those individuals came as settlers. Those were the colonists. And so not every brown person or quote unquote black person that came to America came in terms of a slave ship, and not every person that came based upon being a convict lease situation. Many of those individuals were actually colonists. Many of them were conquistadors. And if people are not willing to look at the totality of history, they are going to miss a number of things, and they are also going to be manipulated into believing some historical facts that are not truth. And here we have additional evidence of the convict indentured servants. So again, it's not enough to just show something that says people were convicted and then they had to serve time as indentured servants. And so what we're looking at now is evidence of the fact that there were individuals who were convicted in Europe and they were transported, they were deported as indentured servants. And so you can see here the log here for this particular indenture situation with the convict leasing situation. Important things to note, this is from 1716, so you can make note of that. You can also see that this is coming out of Liverpool. You can also see that this particular situation is related to rebel prisoners. These are the Jacobites or the Jacobi or the Iacobi. And so these are those rebels. And so they again were convicted of treason and they were given the option of usually execution or deportation. And many, of course, chose deportation. And for a foundational discussion, you might want to go back and look at the video related to this dynamic. But we're going to go forward here and we're going to look at some more evidence related to this convict leasing situation. And now you can see this evidence more clearly. What you can see here, and this is related to the log that you just saw. You can see this is from the Treasury Solicitor, and this is related to the Jacobite Rebellion. And this one is 1945 prosecution papers. And so you can see this command. You can see that this is related to the rebel prisoners. You can also see that it's related to 1716. And here you can see a list of 47 rebel prisoners sent on board the ship known as Two Brothers in order for transportation. And so you can look down below and you can start to see the list information. Now you can see who is in command of this. You can see the name Giltart and Trafford. This is going to be important, so hold on to that. Over to the right, you can see Court of King's Bench, Crown side, and what you see here is the parish of origin for the individual. You see the person's name, so you see John Duncan, you see Donald McBean, and then you see the county of origin, and then you even see the prison that the individual was held in prior to the transportation. And again, as we've discussed in previous discussions, it's important to do that surname tracing. And so the surname tells quite a bit. And so you can see of these Jacobite prisoners, you can actually see the real names of real prisoners who were transported to America. They were transported out of Europe. And some of you may even see your own surname on here. So you see Duncan, again, McBean, McIntyre, McIntosh, Smith, Anderson, Handyside, Stewart, of course you would see Stewart there, Cahill, McNabb, McGlasson. You see two spellings of Robertson. You see the Fergusons, Robertsons again, Stewarts, and McCullough. One of the problems is that individuals are assuming that all of these individuals who are being transported out of Europe, they are assuming that they are quote unquote white. And that is an erroneous assumption. And so that's another thing that will keep people from finding their ancestors and looking in all of the right places. And so again, that is an erroneous assumption. And so you don't know for certain the phenotype, if you will, of these individuals. And so again, it's important to follow a number of trails in terms of locating your ancestors. You can see here that people have been misled for a very long time related to the slave ships and the indentured servitude dynamic coming out of Europe. And so you can see here that the Two Brothers is not only listed as a convict transportation ship, this Two Brothers is also a slave ship. And you can also see Two Brothers leaving Bristol, Liverpool, London, and then making its way in terms of that triangular trade to Africa, and then leaving Africa and then coming to the Americas. And you can see landing mainland America. You can see going into Savannah, Charleston, York River. So you can see that those ships actually landed in the Americas. And so you had a dynamic where individuals started off as convicts on these convict ships, and then they were transported to Africa. It's unclear whether or not those individuals actually made it all the way, because some of them may have been left in Africa. They may have been enslaved in Africa. However, for those who made it to the Americas, there's also the possibility that what started off as a convict leasing situation, because of the racialized dynamics, some of those individuals may have been transferred into a chattel slavery dynamic. It's unclear. What is clear, however, is that the convict ship actually was a slave ship. And so you have a dynamic where individuals, it becomes confusing because you have individuals getting off of a slave ship in the Americas. And so there is the assumption that they came from Africa. And so if they have brown skin, they are on this ship. They came as convict deportees, but they get off of a slave ship coming from Africa. There is then the categorization that they came from Africa instead of they came through Africa. And so Africa was a stop off. But that's not where they came from. That's where they came through. And also, you want to make note of the fact that these dynamics with this Two Brothers ship, this Two Brothers ship, or ships named Two Brothers. This shipping was occurring during a very specific time. This specific time period is during the time period of those Jacobite revolutions, and also the rebellions that were going on in other parts of Europe. And so you can see that for this time frame. It's a very time limited time frame. Now we're going to look at some more data to show that there is this dynamic of using the convict ships as slave ships. And so again, this becomes very confusing, but we're going to look at the Scipio. We've looked at the Scipio before in a prior discussion. We're going to look at it more closely though this time. And so you can see the one with the 92361 voyage ID. You see that at top, and then you see it at the bottom. And then you also see the name that goes along with it. So you see that the Scipio left Liverpool. It went to Africa, a port unspecified, and ended up in Antigua. And you see Edward Trafford. You see that name. You go down below and you look at the log for the prisoners, and what do you see? You see those names, Guildhart and Trafford. And so clearly this is the same dynamic going on here. And so again, it makes it very difficult to ascertain where people might have come from, and so it becomes very confusing. But what this does explain is how you could have a large number of individuals come from Europe and go through Africa and end up in the Americas. And in some instances, you might have individuals who come off of the ship and those individuals are enslaved. You have another group of individuals that come off of the ship and those individuals are indentured servants. And so after a relatively short period of time, those individuals would be set free. Those individuals would comprise those individuals identified as free persons of color. And so again, the free persons of color, it's not, that identifier is not simply limited to individuals who would be understood as Indians. And so you have all of these brown Europeans coming over, and they would be the individuals very clearly identified as free persons of color, because they did not lose their status, their free status technically. They were simply indentured servants. And there are categories when you look at census data for other countries, particularly in the Caribbean, you will see sometimes information related to servants versus slaves. And so what should be clear now is that not every person who's identified as a Negro was actually an African, or in the alternative, an American Indian. And so in many instances, you had individuals who were classified as Negro who were actually Europeans. And so they came over based upon perhaps being convicted of treason because of one of the rebellions, or they may have come over because they were settlers or colonists. And we're going to look at an example of that. And so what this is going to show is that individuals should not jump to the conclusion that simply because their ancestors were never enslaved, that automatically meant that their ancestors were American Indians. They should also not automatically jump to the conclusion that an indentured servitude contract automatically translated into being an American Indian. Many times what was happening was you were talking about an individual who was coming from Europe, hence all of those European names. Now, some people may be uncomfortable with that because they have bought into the narrative that all of these European names came from slave masters. But if a person is holding on to the idea that their ancestors were not enslaved, then the explanation for the European surname would be, more often than not, a European ancestry. And coming from Europe might be an explanation for why there was no heavy missionary initiative in terms of enslaved individuals in the United States. And you might even note that the quote unquote slave Bible was specifically for Negro slaves in the Caribbean, and so the British West India Islands. And so again, people might want to think about this in terms of understanding their ancestry. There was no big push to have enslaved individuals in America read the Bible. In many instances, they were prohibited from reading the Bible. And so people need to ask the question of why that would be and why there was no need for this heavy missionary initiative. The individuals, if they were coming from Europe, they were probably more often than not very familiar with the Bible and perhaps already Christians. Another reason there is confusion related to enslaved individuals and free persons of color is there has not been a significant amount of discussion related to the fact that some individuals who were brown that came over to the Americas, again, some of them were settlers and some of them were colonists and some of them were conquistadors. And so some of them were already in the category known as gentry or peerage. And so we're going to look at an example of that because there has been a conflation of a particular individual's identity, and there has been an assertion that the individual was African American when in fact they were not. And that individual is John Hanson. And so you can see a depiction of John Hanson in the middle. Of course, individuals who are into this denial dynamic might insist that you can look at his features and see that he is a full-blooded Indian, and you can look at two individuals off to the right who are identified as Indian, and so many individuals may deny this person's actual ancestry. And so many people have perhaps assumed that he had been enslaved prior to going into public service. But what you can see here is he was from Charles County, and he is identified by the state of Maryland as Charles County Gentry. And so you can see some genealogical information here on him. And you can see underlined in 1780, he was elected to the Continental Congress and was elected the president of that body on November 5th of 1781. And you can also see further down that he was also one of the signers of the Articles of Confederation. And this is one of the reasons why it is really important to make sure that when people are giving you information that they have something to actually back it up. And examples are not necessarily evidence. You actually want to see some documentation related to this specific situation. And so with this particular individual, John Hanson, you can see it says down at the bottom, Hanson was the self-educated son of Charles County, Maryland. So you just saw previously on the Maryland government page, they've identified him. His family lived in Maryland for 3 generations. Now, what some people are doing is translating this to, oh, he must have been an Indian. But what you see here is beginning with the immigration from England of his grandfather, for whom he was named. And then you see his marriage to Jane Conti in Maryland, and that they produced 9 children. And so you can see that this person, even though this person is brown, they have a long history that goes back to Europe. And so this person is not from Africa. This person is not an Indian. That's not to say he doesn't have any Indian ancestry, because it's not clear, who his ancestors were married to. However, he has an ancestry, and that surname comes from Europe. And as a matter of fact, you can see information related to him and the Queen of Sweden. His family is related to those individuals. And so Again, it is important to understand the totality of this situation and not make assumptions about slavery or Indian identity or European identity. And this should really get people thinking about how they are going to pursue understanding who their ancestors are. So you can see that it's not as clear cut as it may have been appearing previously. So you can see where you might have ancestors that came from Africa. You might have ancestors that came through Africa. You might have ancestors that were already here on the land, but the likelihood that an individual in current times is actually a full-blooded Indian is slim to none. And part of the reason for that is you had conquistadors come over, and in many instances, many Indian groups were annihilated. And you also had this process of ethnic cleansing that took place. So you had the conquistadors and the settlers and the colonists actually engaging in ethnic cleansing related to the Indians. And so you did not have that many that survived. I know many people believe that there was a huge number, but what's happening is you are often seeing the descendants of those mergers between Indians and conquistadors or settlers. In many instances, the men were annihilated and then the women were taken. Now, regardless of what position an individual takes related to believing that slavery occurred or not believing that slavery occurred, one of the things that people need to be careful about is devaluing human life. And so that is a big part of what is going on with this dynamic related to descendants of enslaved individuals and descendants of those identified as Indians. Many people are actually elevating the value of real estate and land over the value of human life in their rhetoric. And so you want to be very careful about that. Devaluing human life and simply saying that individuals were property and standing on that demonstrates a lack of empathy and human regard. And so you want to be very careful about that dynamic. Again, particularly when individuals are insisting on empathy related to what they perceive is a loss of land. And so the loss of human life, when we're talking about chattel slavery, that is significantly more important than the value of property. And as we wrap up this very long discussion related to slavery denial, one of the important things to keep in mind is, again, this need to show proof. And so when individuals are talking about revising history, or they are telling you that they have some new knowledge, some new insight, you want to see proof of this new knowledge. You want to see proof of this new insight. It's not enough to simply make the assertion or engage in theatrics. What you need to see is evidence, and you need to see evidence for each assertion. And so when someone says that slavery did not occur, you need to see evidence of that. You cannot accept that at face value. When someone says that all of the brown people were simply indentured servants and they just had bad indentured servant contracts, you need to see evidence of that. Do not just accept things at face value when someone is telling you something that goes completely against what historical record says. Now, that's not to say that historical record is infallible. Of course it's not. However, but when someone is asserting that the historical record is in error, it is incumbent upon them to provide the valid and reliable evidence and sources to back up what they are saying. They should give you sufficient data so that you can double back and check it out for yourself. So it's not sufficient just to do a video, to have music, theatrics, exciting, entertaining things. You really need to see that cold, hard evidence. And so what we've covered today is the evidence of slavery actually taking place. We've seen the evidence of art being used as slavery denial. We've seen the evidence that slavery and sharecropping are not the same things. We've also looked at substantial census data and slave voyage data to prove that slavery did occur. We've also looked at data to prove that there was a conflation in terms of the indentured servitude convict leasing dynamic and the transatlantic slave trade. And so we've seen evidence of all of that. We've also seen evidence of the fact that not all free persons of color were American Indians. We've also seen that all persons of color were not enslaved. We've also seen that not all quote-unquote Negroes or black persons or persons of color came from Africa or were indigenous to the Americas. We've seen through proof that individuals who are brown and have those European surnames often came from Europe. Social media is a wonderful platform, but what is often happening is that individuals are using social media to promote this idea that they have new and improved knowledge that educators did not have. And so there is this advancing of this idea that they have this untold truth, this untold knowledge, when in fact, if it was untold and if it was really a secret, you wouldn't know it either. And so what people are doing is simply sharing often what has already been accumulated by someone else. You can even take the slave voyages data. Even though that data was presented, that is not new data. That is old data that was available. It just took a little bit of research. And so what you need to start doing for individuals who are claiming they are educators, they are teachers, these nouveau teachers on social media, you need to start asking for the data from those individuals, and they need to be willing to produce the actual data. It is then up to you to decide whether or not you understand that data as both valid and reliable. And oftentimes when you're on the internet, you don't have access to the raw data. So you do need to sometimes go behind the individual and do your own research. And so in this instance, what you might do is go to the slave voyages database and check for yourself to see if what you saw here, you actually see it for yourself. Same thing with the census. If you go to the census data, you should also see that there were slave schedules. But you need to get in the habit of going behind individuals that are presenting all of this new knowledge that no one else has. You need to start going behind those individuals and making sure that what they are saying actually pans out. The fact is that slavery did happen. Another fact is that individuals have varied backgrounds, and each background is going to be unique to the person. You owe it to yourself, you owe it to your ancestors to know who you are. And so now you know that if you are in America, in the Americas, that you need to do a little bit more checking in terms of understanding your ancestry. Some people are going to insist that they are full-blooded Indians, and they should stand stand on that square. However, for those individuals who understand themselves as having what's called a creolized identity, they have a diverse background, it is incumbent upon you to look at the evidence related to the slave trade coming out of Africa and coming through Africa in getting to a better understanding of your ancestry, because the likelihood that you have European ancestry and perhaps some African ancestry and perhaps some American ancestry is pretty high. But don't get discouraged because you can't find these proverbial American Indian ancestors. You may have ancestors that came from other places, and simply because they were free does not necessarily equate to automatically being an Indian. And so you may be pursuing the Indian identity, but you might be going down a wrong road. And so you just want to open up all of the possibilities. Remember, knowledge is power, and knowledge of self is the most important. And it's important that you not allow other people to define who you are. Take care and see you soon.